Welcome to The Widow's Son Spoke in Silence, a chilling Miss Marple mystery where a quiet village hides deadly secrets. When a man is found dead by the pond, only Miss Marple sees the truth behind the silence. Can she solve the mystery before the whispers turn dangerous? Where are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. The village of Cather's Hollow was a place where time seemed to stroll rather than march. It was tucked neatly between rolling meadows and sleepy woods, its cottages lined with ivy and gossip. Every lane had a story, and every villager had two opinions, one for the churchyard, another for the post office. On a brisk autumn morning, the vicarage garden was abuzz with the preparations for the annual harvest tea, a tradition older than most of its guests. Mrs. Penelope Carter, the vicar's wife, oversaw the event with her usual fluttering hands and mild hysteria. "Do be careful with those cakes, Nora," she cried to the young maid. "If the jam runs, we shall have to serve them upside down." The guests began to gather by three. The scent of warm scones mingled with chrysanthemums, and the sound of polite laughter drifted over the hedges. Among them, seated quietly near the rose bushes, was Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles flashing like sunlight on silver. Her pale blue eyes moved from face to face, taking in what others dismissed. The nervous tap of a man's finger, the strained smile of a woman too eager to please. It was a pleasant affair until the arrival of Mrs. Lydia Harrow, the widow from Hillcrest Cottage, and her son, Daniel. The two were rarely seen in company. Lydia, a tall, austere woman with mourning still in her wardrobe though her husband had been gone 3 years, had the kind of presence that unsettled people without quite knowing why. Her son, however, was a stranger to most. Daniel Harrow was a handsome young man, though pale and withdrawn, his eyes fixed on some invisible horizon. There had been whispers that he was not quite right. He seldom spoke, and when he did, it was either too softly to hear or too abruptly to ignore. Still, Mrs. Carter had invited them out of charity or curiosity, depending on whom you asked. Miss Marple noticed at once the stiffness between them. The widow's hand rested possessively on Daniel's arm, not affectionate, but controlling. He sat motionless beside her, his gaze fixed on the vicar's apple trees, as though their stillness offered him comfort. Mrs. Carter, determined to make conversation, fluttered over with teacups. "So lovely of you to come, Mrs. Harrow. And Daniel, my dear boy, you must try the sponge. It's Mrs. Willet's famous recipe." Daniel turned to her slowly. "I don't like sweet things," he said simply. His voice was low, but the silence that followed it was immediate. A few villagers exchanged glances. Mrs. Willet herself flushed scarlet. Miss Marple continued knitting. "A pity," she murmured without looking up. "Sweet things have a way of revealing who's bitter." Mrs. Harrow's face stiffened, ever so slightly. The awkwardness passed, as awkwardness often does in polite society, swept under the rug of forced cheerfulness. Soon, the chatter resumed, and the conversation turned to the upcoming autumn fete. Yet the peace was short-lived. Just before dusk, a sudden commotion rose near the vicarage gate. A boy came running from the lane, shouting for help. It was Tom Bridger, the gardener's son, his cheeks pale with fright. "There's someone by the pond, by the old mill pond, lying still as stone," he gasped. Within moments, the garden was in uproar. Mrs. Carter shrieked. Mrs. Willet clutched her pearls, and the vicar hurried off with 2 of the men. Miss Marple, setting her knitting neatly on the chair, rose quietly and followed. The pond lay half hidden behind the churchyard, shaded by willows that drooped like mourners. The water reflected the reddening sky, tranquil, deceptive. By its edge, half in the mud, half in the water, lay a man's body. It was Mr. Owen Rudd, the solicitor from Little Marcham, who had recently moved into a cottage near the post office. His spectacles were gone, his coat torn, his face pale beneath the murky light. "Good heavens," murmured the vicar, bending to check for life. "He's gone." Miss Marple stood a few paces away. Her eyes narrowed. "How very odd," she said softly. "He was meant to attend tea today. Mrs. Carter mentioned it." The vicar nodded gravely. "He sent word this morning, said he was unwell." "Unwell," repeated Miss Marple, her gaze drifting to the water's edge, where faint footprints marked the mud 2 sets, one larger than the other. "I wonder what kind of illness brings a man to a pond." By the time Inspector Craddock arrived from the next town, the village was alive with speculation. Some swore it was an accident, others hinted at suicide, but whispers spread fastest about Mrs. Lydia Harrow. "Mr. Rudd handled her husband's estate," said Mrs. Willett in a voice that carried conveniently across the lane. "There were irregularities, I believe." "And Daniel," added another, lowering her tone though not her curiosity, "was seen walking near the mill pond last evening." By the following morning, suspicion had bloomed like fungus after rain. Daniel Harrow, silent as ever, neither denied nor explained. When the constable questioned him, he simply stared, as though the words belonged to another world. His mother, pale and composed, insisted on his innocence with cold dignity. "My son would never harm anyone," she said. "He is delicate, sensitive." Miss Marple sat in her cottage that evening, her lamp glowing softly against the twilight. She poured herself a modest cup of tea, her thoughts drifting to the scene by the pond. She saw again the torn sleeve, the missing spectacles, the faint trail of footprints leading toward the willows, and then, oddly, the single pressed daisy caught in the mud near the body. A daisy in October. She smiled faintly. "Strange," she murmured to herself. "How people forget that flowers, like secrets, bloom even when they shouldn't." Outside, the church bell tolled 7, its sound rolling gently across the hollow. Somewhere in the distance, Daniel Harrow sat alone on the stone bench behind his mother's cottage, staring into the darkness, his lips moving soundlessly, as though speaking to someone unseen. And though no one heard the words, Miss Marple, with her quiet intuition, might have guessed the truth even then. The widow's son had spoken, but only in silence. Morning light drifted through the curtains of Mary Mead's cottages the following day, and with it came the restless hum of curiosity. Death had a way of unsettling even the most well-fed peace, and by breakfast time, the entire village knew that Mr. Owen Rudd had been found dead by the mill pond. The story changed with every retelling. Some claimed he had drowned himself, others whispered of a struggle, and one or two, lowering their voices with delight, suggested murder. Miss Marple, sitting at her breakfast table with a neatly folded Times beside her, stirred her tea thoughtfully. She had seen tragedy in her Time War widows, domestic scandals, the kind of quiet despair that lived behind lace curtains. But something about this business with Mr. Rudd refused to settle neatly. Her mind returned again and again to that single daisy pressed in the mud near the body. It did not belong there. It was, in its quiet way, a contradiction. And contradictions, Miss Marple knew, were the beginning of all good inquiries. At the post office later that morning, the conversation was brisk and deliciously scandalous. Mrs. Willett, self-appointed voice of the village, leaned against the counter as if declaring news from a pulpit. He was seen, arguing. "You know," she said, lowering her voice dramatically, "Mr. Rudd and Mrs. Harrow, outside the churchyard, last Thursday afternoon," quite raised voices. Mrs. Price, the postmistress, pursed her lips. "Well, she's a proud woman. That one, still in mourning and makes no secret of it. But to argue with her solicitor, it's not respectable." Miss Marple, who had come for a letter from her nephew Raymond, pretended mild distraction, studying the postcard rack. "Poor Mrs. Harrow," she said softly, her tone mild, her eyes sharp. "Still, grief makes one say things one doesn't mean. I remember a lady in Chedworth who accused her gardener of theft because he trimmed her roses too short." The remark drew polite laughter, and the conversation drifted to safer ground. But in the silence that followed, Miss Marple's thoughts ticked quietly onward. By afternoon, Inspector Craddock arrived at Hillcrest Cottage. Mrs. Harrow received him in her sitting room, her composure as immaculate as her dark dress. Daniel sat by the window, gazing into the garden with the same empty stillness that unnerved the inspector. "I understand, Mrs. Harrow," said Craddock, "that Mr. Rudd managed your late husband's affairs. Were there any disagreements?" "Disagreements?" she repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "There were misunderstandings, perhaps. My husband's estate was complex. Mr. Rudd was an ambitious man. He made suggestions I found distasteful, such as—" She hesitated, glancing briefly at Daniel. "He wished to sell the orchard. My husband adored that orchard. I refused." Craddock nodded slowly. "And your son? Was he acquainted with Mr. Rudd?" "Barely," she said sharply. "Daniel is unwell. He doesn't mix with strangers." Daniel turned then, his eyes distant. "He wasn't a stranger," he said quietly. "He used to come to the cottage. Mother didn't like him in the house." Mrs. Harrow's face tightened. "Daniel, please," but the inspector leaned forward. "Why didn't your mother like him?" Daniel looked at the carpet, speaking so softly Craddock had to strain to hear. "Because he said things that made her angry. About father. About money." He hesitated, as if listening to something unseen. "And about me. What about you, Daniel?" But the young man did not answer. His mother rose abruptly. "This interview is over," she said coldly. "My son is not to be interrogated like a criminal." Craddock, accustomed to obstinate witnesses, stood and replaced his hat. "Very well, Mrs. Harrow, but I may need to speak with you again." Miss Marple, that same afternoon, was visited by the vicar's wife, whose face glowed with the satisfaction of one carrying fresh gossip disguised as moral concern. "My dear Miss Marple," she began breathlessly, "they say the police suspect Daniel Harrow." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Oh, I doubt the inspector has formed such opinions so soon," she said mildly. "Still, young men are impulsive creatures. One mustn't judge too swiftly." "Mrs." Carter leaned forward. "You think he might have done it, then?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that one should first ask what Mr. Rudd was doing by the pond and with whom. A man doesn't go walking to water in a torn coat for pleasure." As Mrs. Carter departed, full of new material for her afternoon rounds, Miss Marple stood by the window, looking out over the garden. The evening light stretched long and golden over the lawns. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, and a dog barked. It was a picture of peace, but in the shadows, something unsettled lurked. Her gaze drifted toward Hillcrest Cottage. "A widow who will not let go," she murmured, "and a son who cannot speak what he knows. There's something in that house that's been buried longer than Mr. Harrow." She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. "The truth," she added, "always grows where people least expect it, rather like a daisy by the pond." Rain came in the night, a soft, persistent drizzle that turned the lanes to ribboned mud and laid a sheen upon the pond like breath upon glass. By morning, Cather's Hollow wore a washed face, but the village mind had not been cleansed of its new obsession. At the post office, the queue was longer than the postal needs of 30 cottages could possibly justify. At the grocer's, 2 ladies argued politely over the ripeness of pears while trading theories with the deftness of card sharps. Miss Marple, who had never cared for pears, walked past them both with her umbrella neatly furled and her thoughts very much open. Inspector Craddock was at Mr. Rudd's cottage on Mill Lane, and Miss Marple, arriving with a small pot of quince jelly for the inspector's tea, found no one bold enough to deny her entry. The cottage was tidy in the way of men who dislike untidiness, but have no gift for order. Papers were stacked in careful, incorrect piles, and a thin film of dust lay upon the windowsill, except where a square had been recently disturbed. The scent was of paper, ink, and something faintly medicinal. Craddock glanced up from the desk. "You do choose your moments, Miss Marple. I have always found," she said, setting the jelly down, "that moments rarely choose one to advantage. One must make do." Her eyes took in the desk blotter, the blotter's shadow on the wood, and the slight, damp crescent on the floorboards by the door, no larger than a teacup saucer. "How inconvenient the rain is. It leaves little prints of intention everywhere. Weave the doctor's note. Head injury before the water. Likely a fall or a blow. Spectacles missing. Pockets turned out lightly, as if someone changed their mind." "A curious kind of thief," Miss Marple murmured. She lifted the blotter, as if idly rearranging, and Craddock, who had learned the futility of stopping her, allowed it. Beneath, the wood was paler, protected from sun. A rectangle just to the side darker suggested that something else had once rested there, not the blotter but very near it. "He moved something recently," she said. "A box, perhaps, or a ledger he didn't wish to be seen by casual callers." Craddock tapped the desk. "We've a ledger. Fees and appointments. Yesterday evening, there's a note. Hill, 6:30. Nothing more. No client named Hill in his books." "Not Hill," Miss Marple said gently. "Hillcrest. It's how busy men spare themselves the trouble of writing an address they know too well." She did not look at him as she said it. She looked at a cheap spectacle case on the mantel, empty, and beside it a second pair with one arm, mended clumsily with thread. "Men of habit," she went on, "do not go to ponds at dusk without their proper glasses when they have a spare to hand." He left with his spectacles, and someone kept them. "Mrs. Harrow again," Craddock said, though without satisfaction. If he meant to see her at 6:30, "Perhaps," Miss Marple said. Her umbrella tip touched something under the desk. She knelt with a small sound that might have been a sigh and retrieved a sliver of wax, translucent and pale. She held it up. "Candle wax. Not from household candles, I think. Altar candles are purer, burn clean, and this is very clean indeed." She set it on the blotter. The vicarage had a harvest tea. There would have been arranging at the church as well. Craddock frowned. "You're importing the entire parish into my room, Miss Marple." "It is the habit of parishes to import themselves everywhere," she replied. Her gaze drifted to the windowsill where the dust's clean square had recently framed a small object. A box of visiting cards, perhaps. Or, she considered, a photograph. People remove photographs when they no longer suit. They remove them in a temper. He followed her look. "We found no photographs at all." "Then Mr. Rudd had very little sentiment," Miss Marple said. "Or else someone else had too much." She smiled kindly at Craddock, who did not find it reassuring, and asked if she might step outside, just for a breath. He let her. The cottage path betrayed what rain cannot quite erase. The faint, double-imprinted tread of boots pacing, then striding, then dragging. At the gate latch, Miss Marple's gloved finger traced a smear where fresh mud had been wiped by a hand, impulsive enough to do it and careful enough not to use a handkerchief. She stooped, pinched a single crushed petal from the grass verge, a white ray floret, browned at the edge. A daisy again, in October, where no daisies should be. She had seen one by the pond. On Mill Lane she met Tom Bridger's father, cap in hand, sorrow on his honest face. "Terrible business, miss," he said. "Tom won't sleep proper. Says he sees Mr. Rudd when he shuts his eyes." "Poor boy," Miss Marple said softly. "Children see what truth leaves behind when it goes out of doors. Tell him to keep his eyes open a moment longer and remember instead. Did Mr. Rudd wear his hat?" The gardener blinked. "No, miss. Now you say it, no hat." "How odd," Miss Marple murmured when he had passed. "Men who guard their scalps from drizzle will guard them from dusk." She walked the cut through the churchyard, pausing beneath the willows whose thin leaves rattled like quiet applause. On the low stone coping, lay a tiny curl of thread, grey and fine, caught on rough mortar. Miss Marple rolled it between finger and thumb, thinking of Daniel Harrow's cuff. The boy's coat had been too short at the wrist, its stitching neat but overstrained. Not grey thread. Black. This thread was paler, better quality, the kind men of profession wore with city suits. At Hillcrest Cottage, the curtains were half drawn, though it was not yet noon. Miss Marple did not go to the door. She stood by the side path where the soil told stories. 2 sets of prints again, one narrower and brisk, one heavier and more irregular, superimposed and muddled by late rain. She noticed what was not there. No bicycle track, no cartwheel, no third-party light enough to leave nothing. She noticed, too, a faint ring of ash near the coal bunker, and, just within it, the ghost of a circle, as if a photograph had been burnt upon a plate and lifted away before the edges blackened. She went home by the long way, allowing her thoughts to settle like silt. When she reached her sitting room, she took out a little notebook and wrote 3 lines. Men without hats do not go to ponds. Spectacles withheld alter how a man sees also how others see him. Daisies bloom out of season when planted. She added, after a moment, a 4th. Widows fear what silence might. Tell sons speak it. Then she folded the page, made tea, and waited for grief. In Cather's Hollow had a habit of knocking, not at the loudest doors, but at the quietest windows. And sure enough, before the kettle had done its small fussing, the tap at her pane came, timid, urgent, and not at all rehearsed. It was Nora from the vicarage, eyes wide, hands twisting her apron, with a message that would, Miss Marple knew, make the pond whisper louder. Missus. Carter had found in the church poor box a torn envelope addressed to Mrs. Lydia Harrow, and inside, not money, but the missing spectacles. Miss Marple listened quietly as Nora stammered out her story, the poor girl pale from both fright and fascination. The spectacles had been found early that morning, wrapped in a torn envelope bearing Mrs. Harrow's name, tucked discreetly inside the church poor box as if left there in haste. Nora swore she hadn't touched them, only glimpsed the faint gleam of metal beneath the folded note. When she came to polish the brass candlesticks, Miss Marple sent her home with a reassuring pat and the calm suggestion of a cup of tea. Then, alone, she sat very still for several minutes, her teacup cooling beside her, her thoughts weaving threads tighter than any wool she'd ever wound. By midday, Inspector Craddock arrived at her gate, his boots marked with damp clay and his face lined from hours of village questioning. "You've heard about the spectacles, I suppose," he said. "Every tongue in Cather's Hollow seems to wag faster than my pen can move." Miss Marple smiled mildly. "It does save one the cost of a newspaper, doesn't it? And what have we learned from all this waggery?" "That no one admits to leaving them there," he replied grimly. "Mrs. Carter swears the poor box was empty yesterday morning. No sign of tampering, just the envelope, plain and unsealed, with Mrs. Harrow's name scrawled in a man's hand." "Not Mr. Rudd's hand, surely?" "No. We compared it. Different style. And here's another odd thing. The lenses are cracked. One, completely shattered. Doctor thinks the spectacles were broken before they hit the water. I'll tell you frankly, Miss Marple, I don't like how this is shaping. Every road leads back to that widow and her son. Roads that lead too straight," Miss Marple murmured, "tend to have been swept clean by someone's broom." She stood, fastening her shawl. "Might I see them?" The spectacles. Craddock produced them from his pocket, wrapped carefully in tissue. Miss Marple turned them over in her hands. One lens indeed fractured, the bridge bent, as though crushed beneath sudden pressure rather than dropped. The frame was faintly smudged with something dull and brown, mud or blood, though not enough to tell. She looked up thoughtfully. "You said the handwriting was a man's?" He nodded. "Yes," though hurried, slanted right. The vicar thought he'd seen something like it before, but he couldn't say where. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Vicars so often think that. They hear so much confession by implication." That afternoon, she walked once more toward the church, where the willows dripped rain like tears from heaven. The poor box stood near the entrance, a humble wooden chest with a narrow slot and a faint scent of polish and candle wax. She lingered near the pulpit, observing how the shadows from the stained glass fell across the floor, red, blue, gold, until one patch of pale light drew her eye to the steps leading toward the vestry. A scuff mark, faint but deliberate, marred the stone there. A man's shoe, not heavy, polished recently. Inside, Mrs. Carter was arranging hymn sheets, her movements brisk but nervous. "Terrible business, Miss Marple," she said in a low voice. "The inspector asked so many questions I thought he meant to arrest the vicar next. Heavens! Imagine the scandal." Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the altar candles, freshly trimmed, but one bore a faint dent along its base, as though gripped too tightly. "And you're certain?" she asked gently. "The poor box was empty yesterday." Mrs. Carter hesitated. "Quite certain. Unless, well, the church was unlocked most of the afternoon. The vicar was meeting Mr. Hayworth about the charity accounts." "Mr. Hayworth? The church warden?" "Yes, and he's in a dreadful state about all this. He says he's misplaced a ledger, the very one listing the harvest donations. Can you imagine? The Lord's money vanished into thin air." Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic and left shortly after, her mind quietly knitting thoughts into patterns. The missing ledger, the crushed spectacles, the wax, the daisies, little things, but none of them quite belonging where they were found. As she passed Hillcrest Cottage again, she noticed Daniel Harrow standing in the garden, his eyes fixed on the wet earth. His mother was nowhere to be seen. The boy's lips moved faintly. Miss Marple stopped at the gate. "Good afternoon, Daniel," she said softly. "It's a sad day, isn't it? So much silence about us." He looked up at her with pale eyes that did not quite focus. "He was afraid," Daniel whispered. "He said she would burn the truth away." Before Miss Marple could ask what he meant, Mrs. Harrow appeared sharply in the doorway. "Daniel, come inside at once." The door closed before Miss Marple could answer, and the sound of the bolt sliding home followed her down the path. As she walked back toward her cottage, the wind stirred through the trees again, whispering like distant voices. Miss Marple did not hurry. She had learned long ago that truth, like a frightened bird, must come to rest on its own, but tonight she felt certain it was circling close. Something had been burnt, something that could not bear to be seen by daylight, and someone, somewhere, had written a name, not to send a letter, but to hide a crime. The next morning dawned dull and mist-heavy, the kind of grey that softened edges and made even familiar lanes feel uncertain. Miss Marple stood by her window, stirring her tea absently as she watched the fog curl around the garden gate. Her mind was already turning over Daniel's strange words. She would burn the truth away. That sort of remark, she knew, rarely came from fancy. Children and the simple-minded often saw things clearly, only to be dismissed by those who preferred comfortable blindness. By 10 o'clock, Inspector Craddock came calling again. His face was drawn, his coat spattered with mud, his manner weary but curious. "Morning, Miss Marple. You won't be surprised to hear we've had another development. A witness, if you can call her that." "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "The village provides witnesses as easily as daisies, some real, some imagined. Who is it this time?" "Mrs. Phipps," she claims. "She saw Mr. Rudd walking toward the church on the evening he died. Says he had a parcel under his arm. She thought nothing of it till this morning when she remembered his spectacles." "Mrs. Phipps has a good heart," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though a selective memory. Still, the parcel is interesting, and she's certain it was toward the church. Quite certain. Which means either he stopped there before going to the pond, or—" Craddock hesitated. "Someone met him there." Miss Marple set down her cup. Someone who might have known the church would be empty for a time, and who would have a reason to place something in the poor box after. The inspector nodded. "Exactly. And there's more." We've found that missing ledger the church warden was wailing about, half burned, in the vicarage ash bin. Someone tried to destroy it. Ah, Miss Marple murmured. And yet not quite succeeded. People who burn things in haste seldom ensure the ashes, tell no tales. What remained of it? Enough to show a page torn out, one with the name Harrow written beside a rather generous donation sum. Except there's no record of Mrs. Harrow ever making it. And the handwriting, well, it matches Mr. Rudd's. Miss Marple's eyes brightened. How very inconvenient for the widow if that page were to reappear, and very convenient for someone if it did not. She folded her hands. I think, Inspector, that our Mr. Rudd came to the church that evening not for prayer, but for confrontation. Craddock frowned. You think Mrs. Warren Craddock, Harrow met him there? I think, Miss Marple said gently, that he met someone who feared exposure. The letter in the poor box was not meant to incriminate, it was meant to redirect suspicion. A gesture of false conscience, perhaps. Broken spectacles, torn envelope symbols of regret, are quite fashionable with the guilty. The inspector sighed. You always make it sound like a Sunday homily. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Sin and Sunday rarely keep separate diaries. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage under the pretext of visiting Mrs. Carter. But her steps veered instead toward the small churchyard gate. The rain had left the path slick, but she moved carefully, noting the faint indentation of recent footprints, 2 sets, both light, one overlapping the other. She bent and touched the edge of a print. The mud was still damp, meaning the visit had been recent, within hours. Perhaps even that morning. Inside the church, the air was cool and faintly scented with wax. She paused near the altar rail, then moved to the vestry door, which stood slightly ajar. The scent there was sharper paraffin and burnt paper. Her eyes fell upon a metal box by the wall, its lid open and its contents scattered. Old parish letters, scraps of receipts, a half-melted candle. Someone had searched in haste. Miss Marple was stooping to pick up a charred scrap when a soft footfall behind her made her straighten. Lydia Harrow stood in the doorway, her black coat buttoned high, her face pale against the gloom. I might ask, she said coldly, why you're prowling about the Lord's house as though it were your own. I might ask, Miss Marple replied with gentle politeness. The same of you, my dear, though I fancy neither of us has come for prayer. Mrs. Harrow's eyes flickered. I came to speak to the vicar. He's not here. Nor, I think, was he when you were last here, Miss Marple said softly, though I dare say someone else was, someone who brought a ledger and expected honesty in return. Lydia's composure wavered for a moment, barely, but enough for Miss Marple to see it. You have quite the imagination, Miss Marple, she said sharply. You'd do well to keep it to your knitting. Indeed, Miss Marple said mildly, stepping aside. Knitting does reveal tangles others prefer not to see. She let Lydia pass, but as the widow brushed by, Miss Marple caught a faint scent smoke and lavender soap, the same she had noticed near the ash circle behind the cottage. When the door closed, Miss Marple exhaled slowly. The pieces were moving, as they always did, quietly and without fanfare. That night, she wrote in her little notebook again. Ledger burned. Spectacles offered as sacrifice. Widow frightened, not guilty, fear for another, perhaps. The son speaks truth, others silence. If the truth was burned, the fire began at Hillcrest. And for the first time, Miss Marple allowed herself to wonder had Daniel seen the act itself, or merely heard it whispered through the willows, where guilt has a way of echoing long after the deed is done. The following day brought with it a false brightness, sunlight breaking through clouds as though the world wished to forget its shadows. Yet beneath that light, the tension in Cather's Hollow grew more brittle. Tolled for morning prayers, but few came. Even devotion could not compete with gossip. And at Hillcrest Cottage, the curtains stayed drawn. Miss Marple, strolling toward the post office under the guise of errands, noted how people's voices fell when she approached. She smiled kindly at them all the same. Secrets, she often thought, were rather like weeds. They withered faster when given attention. She purchased her stamps, exchanged a few words about the weather, and then walked quietly toward the lane that led to the Harrows' garden. The front gate stood open, swaying faintly in the wind. She hesitated before knocking, for the sound of raised voices drifted through the half-shuttered window. Lydia Harrow's tight, trembling tones, and another's, lower, softer, yet edged with distress. Daniel's. "I didn't mean to look," he said. "It was on the fire, and I wanted to know why. You said not to touch, but it had his name, Mr. Rudd's name, written there. Daniel, stop." Lydia's voice cut in sharply, strained with more fear than anger. "You mustn't speak of it again. Do you hear? If anyone asks, you saw nothing. You remember nothing. Do you understand me?" There was silence, then a sound like a chair scraping back. "But he was shouting," Daniel said quietly. "He said he'd tell. He said people would know what you did." Miss Marple stepped back softly, her heart tightening. She moved away before her presence could be noticed, her mind already working through the implications. Lydia burning papers, Daniel witnessing a quarrel, perhaps even the last moments before Mr. Rudd's death. But Lydia's fear was too profound to be that of guilt for murder. There was something else beneath it, something darker, older. Later that morning, Inspector Craddock appeared again, his manner brisk but uneasy. "We've got something new, Miss Marple," he said. "A letter arrived for us posted yesterday afternoon. No return. Address. It names Daniel Harrow as the killer. Says he struck Rudd in a fit of rage when the man threatened his mother." Miss Marple frowned. "Posted after the crime? And from where?" "The next village over, Little Marcham. Likely dropped there by someone from here trying to divert suspicion. The handwriting's shaky, could be disguised. Still, it's enough to stir talk. The superintendent's pressing to bring the boy in for questioning." "I should be very cautious about that," Miss Marple said softly. "A frightened boy tells lies easily, but so do frightened mothers." She paused, her voice gentler. "Has anyone examined the churchyard lately? The path by the pond?" Craddock looked puzzled. "We combed it, of course." "Ah, but not after the rain, I think," Miss Marple murmured. "Rain can erase, but it can also reveal. Sometimes it softens what was too hard to see." They went together that afternoon. The pond lay still, its surface like tarnished glass, broken only by the faint circles of falling leaves. Craddock's men had already marked where the body had been found. Miss Marple walked along the bank, her eyes searching the muddy verge. "There," she said quietly, pointing with her umbrella tip. "Just beyond that willow root. You see the indentation?" Craddock crouched. "A boot print." "No. 2. One overlaps the other. And the smaller one," Miss Marple added, "is not a man's, nor a boy's. Look at the heel narrow and the toe pointed. A woman's walking boot." The inspector straightened. "You think Lydia Harrow was here after all?" "I think she came after, not before," Miss Marple said. "The soil there is fresher trodden later, when the body was already found. She came to look, perhaps to be sure something was gone, or to leave something behind." He gave a low whistle. "You mean the spectacles?" "Possibly, or perhaps something else. But what matters is why. Guilt moves people to conceal evidence. Fear moves them to protect someone." As they left, the bell from the church tower tolled again, hollow and uncertain. Miss Marple paused to look back. "Inspector," she said softly. "I think the letter naming Daniel was meant to shield someone else entirely, and whoever wrote it knew the truth, that the blow was struck not in rage, but in panic. The kind of panic only comes when a long-guarded secret is threatened to be told." That evening, as dusk crept over the village, she sat by her window once more, knitting laid aside, watching the lamplight flicker through the fog. Somewhere in the dark, a boy's shadow moved near the churchyard wall. Daniel, she thought, but not lost. The time was coming when silence would no longer protect him. The truth was stirring, fragile as smoke, but unstoppable once the wind changed. The night passed without incident, yet it seemed that something had shifted beneath the stillness of Cather's Hollow. When morning came, a thin veil of mist clung stubbornly to the ground, as if reluctant to reveal what it had overheard. Miss Marple woke early, her instincts restless, for she sensed the calm was only a pause before revelation. Somewhere between Lydia Harrow's fear and Daniel's strange words lay the truth. And truth, Miss Marple often thought, had a habit of whispering just before it shouted. By mid-morning, Inspector Craddock arrived again, looking rather graver than usual. "We've detained Daniel Harrow," he said quietly. "It wasn't my choice," the superintendent insisted. "The boy's been brought to the station for questioning." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting, her eyes clear and calm. "That was unwise, Inspector. People who speak little often speak truer than those who talk too much. Still, what has been learned?" "Not much that makes sense. He says Mr. Rudd fell, that there was shouting, and then silence. Claims he didn't touch him. But he also keeps saying, it wasn't the fire that killed him. When we asked what he meant, he went quiet again. His mother's nearly hysterical. "It wasn't the fire that killed him," Miss Marple repeated softly. "Interesting. I think I should like to speak with Mrs. Harrow again." She arrived at Hillcrest Cottage to find Lydia pale, dishevelled, and trembling. The neat order of her sitting room had collapsed, papers strewn, curtains half drawn, the air heavy with the scent of stale smoke. She turned sharply as Miss Marple entered. "If you've come to accuse me again, I'll not listen to another word." "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "I've come to prevent you from making a terrible mistake." Lydia's composure wavered, her voice unsteady. "They've taken my boy. He doesn't understand what's happening. He's different. You see, he says strange things, but he means no harm. He never does." "I know," Miss Marple said softly. "Daniel is not violent. He observes, though others think him odd. And he saw something that frightened him, not because of what he did, but because of what someone else did." Lydia sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Mr. Rudd was blackmailing me," she whispered. "He knew about my husband, about the insurance. It was an accident, but he twisted it, made it sound wicked. He said he'd tell the magistrate unless I paid. I had already given him more than I could bear. That night, he came to the church with papers, demanding another sum. I went to beg him to stop. Daniel followed me, though I didn't know it." Miss Marple nodded quietly, letting her speak. "He was shouting," Lydia went on, her voice breaking. "I tried to reason with him, but he pushed me aside. He said he'd expose me. I left him there and ran home. I swear it. But Daniel must have seen, he must have followed after." Miss Marple reached out and laid a gentle hand on hers. "He followed, yes, but not to harm. Mr. Rudd fell, Lydia. The bruise upon his head came from the stone edge by the pond. The ground was slippery from the rain. He struck his head and drowned. But someone came afterward and tried to turn accident into murder." Lydia stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Afterward?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone who feared that truth would not suffice. The spectacles placed in the poor box, the letter naming Daniel, the burned ledger, all acts of desperation. Someone who believed protecting you required deception." Lydia's face went white. "No," she whispered. "You can't mean—" "I do," Miss Marple said quietly. "Your vicar, Mrs. Carter's husband. He found out about Rudd's extortion. Perhaps he pitied you, perhaps he thought himself righteous. But in his zeal, he destroyed evidence, fabricated guilt, and made a scapegoat of your son. His signature matches the letter's disguise. I saw his handwriting on a sermon note just yesterday." For a long moment, Lydia sat frozen. Then her eyes filled with tears, not of guilt, but release. "He said it was God's justice," she murmured. "That my sin had to be buried with silence. Oh, dear heaven, he meant to protect me." Miss Marple rose quietly. Protection, built on lies, only deepens the wound, my dear. It is time to end it. That afternoon, she went with Inspector Craddock to the vicarage. The confrontation was quiet, almost sorrowful. The vicar stood pale and trembling before the truth laid bare, the weight of his actions breaking his voice. He confessed in halting tones how he found Rudd's body, guessed the connection to Lydia, and sought to shield her by shifting suspicion. When they left, the church bell began to toll for evening prayers. Miss Marple paused beneath the willows, listening as the sound drifted over the pond. The mist was rising again, but in it, the reflections were clear. She thought of Daniel silent, gentle Daniel, whose simple truth had spoken louder than all deceit. Sometimes, she murmured to Craddock, silence tells us everything, words try to hide. The confession came not as thunder, but as rain, steady, inevitable, and quiet. The vicar's voice trembled as he spoke, his words stumbling out with the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting his conscience longer than he could bear. He had gone to the church that night, he said, intending to meet Rudd after hearing whispers of his dealings with Lydia Harrow. When he arrived, Rudd was already dead. Panic took hold of him. He saw the pond, the mud, the broken spectacles, and in that dreadful stillness, he imagined scandal spreading through his parish like fire. Lydia's past, the insurance, the boy's strange behavior, all would become fodder for the cruel delight of the village. And so, in misguided righteousness, he acted. He burned the ledger, hid the spectacles, and later wrote the letter that condemned Daniel, believing, absurdly, that the boy's silence would protect them all. Inspector Craddock listened without interruption, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. "You understand," he said quietly, "that what you've done is a crime. Vicar, you obstructed an investigation, falsified evidence, and nearly destroyed 2 innocent lives." The vicar nodded, eyes hollow. "I know. I meant only to spare them, to preserve what little decency might remain." Miss Marple regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Decency, Mr. Carter is not preserved by deceit. You built your mercy upon fear, and fear has an unfortunate habit of turning on its master." When the inspector led him away to make a formal statement, the vicar's wife stood in the doorway, pale and speechless. She looked at Miss Marple as though seeking explanation, but the old lady only laid a hand on her arm. "He meant well," she said softly, "but goodness, without wisdom, is a very dangerous thing." That evening, the village lay hushed, as though the very trees bent under the weight of what had been uncovered. The truth had a way of unsettling even those untouched by it. In the Rose and Crown, whispers flickered like candlelight. The widow Harrow, they said, had been the true victim all along. Some pitied her, some distrusted her still, and most felt an unspoken guilt for ever having believed her capable of murder. As for Daniel, the sympathy was gentler now, a kind of collective remorse for misunderstanding a boy whose silence had been the purest truth in the room. Miss Marple returned home late, the air cool and still. She set her shawl on the chair and poured herself a modest cup of tea, her mind quiet but not yet at rest. It was always like this after a mystery resolved, the strange stillness after a storm, when one might hear the faintest echo of all that had passed. She thought of the widow sitting alone at Hillcrest Cottage, her son beside her, and of the vicar locked away in silent repentance. Cather's Hollow would recover, as villages always did, but something had shifted forever. The following morning brought an unexpected visitor. Daniel Harrow came to her cottage, his steps slow but sure. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, his face pale but his eyes steady. Miss Marple smiled warmly. "Come in, Daniel. I've just made scones, and I find tea tastes far better when shared." He sat without speaking for a while, watching the steam curl above the teacups. When he finally spoke, it was in a low, halting voice. "They say I don't have to go to the station again." Mr. Craddock said, "It's finished now." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "finished, though the truth seldom ends as tidily as we'd like." He nodded, staring at his hands. "Mother says Mr. Carter wasn't a bad man. She said he only wanted to help. She's quite right, Miss Marple replied. He wanted to help, but in doing so, he forgot that truth helps more than any lie ever could. Daniel looked up suddenly, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't tell anyone what I saw that night. I thought it was wrong to tell. Miss Marple's eyes softened. And what did you see, Daniel? He hesitated, then spoke slowly, as if drawing the memory from the fog itself. Mr. Rudd was shouting at her at Mother. She ran away, crying. Then he slipped. I heard him fall into the water. When I went to help, it was too late. He wasn't moving. Then the vicar came. He looked afraid, like he'd seen a ghost. He told me to go home, that he'd take care of everything. So I did. Miss Marple nodded. You did what any good boy would do when told by a man of the church. But even good men make grave mistakes when they act out of fear. She smiled faintly. You did well, Daniel. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface like the pond water, still and clear after the storm. Daniel's gaze fell to the floor. Will people stop talking now? Oh, I doubt it, Miss Marple said kindly. Villages never quite stop talking, but one day they'll find a new story, and this one will fade into memory. The important thing is that you and your mother are free to live without shadows. He smiled faintly, his first real smile, awkward but genuine, and left with a shy thanks. When the door closed, Miss Marple sat quietly for a while, listening to the distant hum of bees outside her window. There was peace in that sound, humble and unremarkable, yet steady, the sound of life continuing as it always had. That afternoon, Inspector Craddock stopped by once more, hat in hand. Well, Miss Marple, he said, another tangle unraveled. Though I'll admit, I'd never have thought to look twice at the vicar. You saw it before any of us. She chuckled softly. It was Daniel, really. He told me without meaning to. The innocent often point the way they simply lack the words to make us understand. Craddock smiled. You've a remarkable gift, Miss Marple. Oh, no, Inspector, she said, shaking her head. Just an old woman's habit of noticing things mud where it shouldn't be. Words spoken too carefully. Kindness performed a little too late. Murder and deceit, you see, are simply exaggerations of ordinary failings. The seeds are always human. Craddock tipped his hat and departed, and Miss Marple watched him go until the lane was empty again. Evening gathered softly over Cather's Hollow, wrapping the cottages in a hush that felt almost redemptive. Somewhere in the distance, the church bell began to toll once more, slow, even, forgiving. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her fingers deft and sure. Another crime had passed, another truth laid bare, and yet she knew that somewhere, in some quiet village not unlike this one, another little pattern of human folly was already beginning to form. She smiled faintly to herself and said, half aloud, people are much the same everywhere. You know, always hiding what they ought not, always revealing what they never mean to. Then, with the gentlest sigh, she picked up her teacup, savoring the last warmth of the day as the widow's son, somewhere beyond the mist, spoke in silence once more. The following days passed with a deceptive calm, as though the village itself were trying to forget the unpleasantness that had rippled through its quiet lanes. The church reopened for morning prayers, the poor box newly polished and empty, and the pond, once the grim center of attention, reflected only willows and drifting clouds again. Yet beneath this returned stillness, something faintly unresolved lingered, like a half-heard tune one couldn't name. Miss Marple felt it each time she walked through the vicarage lane, a small twinge at the back of her thoughts, as if a single stitch had been dropped in her otherwise tidy piece of knitting. It wasn't doubt about the vicar's confession. His remorse had been real enough, but something about his account remained curiously incomplete. He had admitted to burning the ledger, to hiding the spectacles, to forging the letter in a misguided attempt to shield Lydia and Daniel Harrow. All that was certain, and yet, Miss Marple's instinct whispered that there was another hand somewhere in the tapestry, a touch too faint to see, but woven nonetheless. That intuition sharpened one afternoon when she met Mrs. Carter outside the grocer's. The vicar's wife, usually brisk and over-talkative, looked pale and curiously distracted. She greeted Miss Marple with polite stiffness, then added with an anxious little laugh, "It's such a relief, isn't it, that everything is settled at last? Poor Mr. Carter, of course, will have much to answer for, but the Lord knows his intentions were pure." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied mildly, "though I confess, I've always thought intentions make poor soil for truth. They grow what one hopes, not what is." Mrs. Carter flushed faintly and fumbled her purse. "Oh, you and your sayings, Miss Marple. Well, I must be off. The choir practice can't arrange itself." And with that, she hurried away, her step too quick, her composure too carefully gathered. Miss Marple watched her go, her mind turning. The woman was not grieving her husband's disgrace. She was guarding something. But what could Mrs. Carter possibly still fear, now that the whole village knew? Later that evening, as dusk deepened into the soft gold of candlelight, Miss Marple took her usual stroll through the churchyard. She paused near the willow trees, the air cool and damp with memory. She bent to examine the earth where the footprints had been weeks before. Rain had long since washed them away, but something new caught her eye, a scrap of black ribbon half buried in the soil. She lifted it carefully. It was singed at one end, a burnt ribbon in the very place where Rudd had died. Strange. She turned it between her fingers, recalling the faint scent she'd once noticed on Mrs. Carter's gloves, the same acrid sweetness of wax and smoke. The vicar had burned the ledger. Yes, but had he been the only one to set fire that night? The next morning, Inspector Craddock arrived to deliver the expected news. The vicar, after formal questioning, was to be transferred to a quiet institution for mental exhaustion rather than prison. "He's no criminal, Miss Marple," the inspector said softly. "He's simply broken." Miss Marple nodded. "It is often those who most wish to preserve others who destroy themselves first." She hesitated, then added, "Tell me, Inspector, when the poor box was examined, did anyone take note of the soot marks along its underside?" Craddock blinked. "Soot marks? No, I don't believe so. Why?" "Oh, no reason," she said pleasantly. "Only that I fancy the spectacles were not the first thing placed there in secrecy." Her suspicions were not idle ones. That afternoon, she paid a call to Mrs. Carter, who received her with a nervous graciousness. The drawing room smelled faintly of lavender and ashes. The vicar's absence had left the house in disarray, a piano lid half open, hymnals stacked unevenly, curtains drawn though sunlight pressed against them. "My dear," Miss Marple began kindly, "I wanted to see how you were bearing up. Such ordeals can weigh terribly on the spirit." Mrs. Carter clasped her hands tightly. "I manage. Prayer helps." "Ah, yes. Prayer is rather like knitting. I've always thought one must be careful not to drop a stitch, or the whole pattern unravels. Your husband, I fear, dropped one in his story. You see, there were two fires that night." Mrs. Carter's lips parted, her composure trembling. I don't know what you mean," Miss Marple continued gently, her tone almost conversational. "One in the Bong, church bin, where the ledger burned. The other behind Hillcrest Cottage, where a photograph was reduced to ash. I dare say you remember the photograph. My dear, it once stood upon your piano. Mr. Rudd's likeness, taken during his time on the church committee." Mrs. Carter rose abruptly, pale as linen. "How dare you?" "My dear, there's no need for indignation," Miss Marple said softly. "You were not alone in fearing exposure. Mr. Rudd was blackmailing Lydia Harrow. Yes, but he was also pressing another claim, wasn't he? Against your husband. You see, he'd discovered certain irregularities in the parish funds. Nothing ruinous, merely careless bookkeeping, but enough to cause scandal. I imagine your husband confessed it to you in his panic, and you, determined to save him, went to meet Rudd first." Mrs. Carter sank slowly back into her chair, her voice a whisper. "He wasn't supposed to die." Miss Marple nodded. "I know. You went to plead with him. Things turned. Perhaps you tried to take the papers from him. Perhaps he pushed you away, slipped on the wet grass. It was an accident, but one you could not undo. So you ran to your husband, and together you built the lie that buried him as surely as Rudd was buried in mud." Tears streaked Mrs. Carter's face. "I thought it was God's will that he'd chosen to punish Rudd for his sins, not ours. My husband believed it too." "Oh, Miss Marple, I never meant—" Miss Marple's voice was kind, almost sorrowful. "We rarely mean the harm we do. Yet there it stands, uninvited, demanding to be reckoned with. Your husband's conscience bore the weight of both your guilt and his own, until it crushed him." When Inspector Craddock returned that evening, Miss Marple told him everything with quiet precision. Mrs. Carter made no attempt to deny it. She only wept, murmuring prayers under her breath, as though words might stitch the torn fabric of her faith back together. Carriage took her away. The sound of the church bell floated through the twilight again, slow, mournful, unsteady. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate, watching until the last echo faded. She felt no triumph, only the weary sadness that always followed truth. It had all begun with a whisper, and ended, as most wickedness does, in silence. That night, she wrote one final note in her little book. Not the widow's sin, nor the son's silence, but a wife's desperate mercy born of fear. Evil seldom enters with hatred, it often wears love's face. She closed the notebook, laid down her pen, and smiled faintly at the kettle's soft rumble. The village would sleep peacefully again, never knowing how close it had come to being torn apart by its own decency. Miss Marple, content with the quiet, poured her tea and murmured, "Another stitch mended." The morning after Mrs. Carter's confession was one of those rare autumn dawns that seemed almost ashamed of its own beauty. The sun rose over Cather's Hollow with a soft gold light that touched the church steeple and glinted off the pond where tragedy had first broken the surface of village calm. The mist had lifted, but the air carried that peculiar stillness that follows both a storm and a reckoning. Life, in its gentle persistence, had resumed, though the undercurrent of unease still ran quietly beneath the cobblestones. Miss Marple, having slept little, sat by her window as the clock struck 7, her knitting untouched beside her. Her thoughts were not on wool or breakfast, but on the lingering threads of the case, threads she sensed were still knotted somewhere unseen. For though justice had been rendered in the eyes of law, Miss Marple's own sense of order was less easily satisfied. Mrs. Carter's tearful confession had filled in the missing piece of motive, and Inspector Craddock had, with compassion, arranged for her to be taken away quietly, sparing the parish the scandal of a public trial. Yet, Miss Marple's mind, trained by years of human observation and sharpened by sorrow, refused to rest on mere conclusions. She had learned long ago that truth, much like human nature, seldom arrived clean and complete. It came layered, delicate as lace, and one tug on a loose strand could unravel a far larger design. That morning, the postman delivered a single letter, its envelope thin and cream-colored, addressed in an unfamiliar, masculine hand. Miss Marple turned it over curiously before opening it. The contents were brief. "Dear Miss Marple, you do not know me, but I am the brother of Owen Rudd. I arrived in Little Marcham yesterday, having only just learned of his death through the papers. I am told it was an accident, though I confess, I do not understand how such a thing could happen to a man so careful as my brother. I should like to speak with you, if you would allow it. Sincerely, Thomas Rudd." Miss Marple folded the letter thoughtfully. So, the past was not yet done with Cather's Hollow. She had met Owen Rudd, but briefly. His quiet arrogance and cool demeanor had struck her as belonging to a man who believed himself immune to consequence. Still, there had been something brittle in his manner, a restlessness that spoke of a man used to control, but never at peace. That his brother should appear now, after the dust had begun to settle, seemed almost providential, or perhaps, she thought, simply the natural way of things. The truth, once disturbed, rarely lies still again. By midday, Thomas Rudd arrived at her cottage. He was taller than his late brother, leaner, but with the same sharply defined features and pale grey eyes. His manner was polite, but not warm. There was an edge of quiet determination about him, the kind that made Miss Marple instantly wary. He declined tea at first, then accepted it with the hesitation of a man not used to kindness. "I hope you don't find this visit intrusive," he began. "But I couldn't rest, without knowing. My brother was not well liked, perhaps, but he was no fool, Miss Marple. He was methodical. The papers said he drowned accidentally, yet I've seen the coroner's notes. There was a bruise, a broken lens. Things don't align." Miss Marple watched him closely. "Your brother's death was most tragic, Mr. Rudd. Accidental, yes, though the circumstances surrounding it were made complicated by others' fear and concealment. You must understand, the poor vicar and his wife both tried, in misguided ways, to protect the reputations of others involved." Thomas Rudd frowned, leaning forward. "So there was foul play?" "Not in the way you might think," she said softly. "Your brother fell by his own misstep, though one might say it was pride that made his footing unsteady." He looked at her sharply. "Pride? Indeed. He was blackmailing two people here, one for money, the other for silence. Such schemes rarely end gracefully. He sought to press her, control others through shame. And shame, Mr. Rudd, is a most dangerous currency. It often changes hands unexpectedly." Thomas's gaze hardened. "So, he was killed. You can call it what you like, but that's what you mean. Someone caused his death." Miss Marple sighed. "Perhaps, but in moral matters, causation and guilt are not always the same. His death was the culmination of cruelty meeting desperation. No single hand pushed him, and yet every frightened heart around him bore some share of the weight." He stood abruptly, restless. "Then the law has failed him?" "On the contrary," Miss Marple replied gently. "The law has spared him the indignity of exposure, which, I think, is mercy enough for a man like your brother." Thomas said nothing for a long while, staring into the fire that flickered low in her grate. Finally, he asked, almost grudgingly, "And the others? The ones he hurt?" "They will live," Miss Marple said simply. "That is their sentence and their grace." He left soon after, his gratitude polite but hollow. Miss Marple watched from her window as he disappeared down the lane toward the church, where she suspected he meant to see the place himself. She could not quite shake the unease his visit had stirred. Men like Thomas, she thought, rarely came seeking closure. They came seeking someone to blame. That evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, a quiet knock came at her door. It was Lydia Harrow. Her face was drawn, her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But there was a calmness about her that Miss Marple had not seen before. "I came to thank you," she said softly, "for Daniel's sake. He's been sleeping again. Properly this time. The nightmares have stopped." "I'm glad to hear it," Miss Marple said. "He has a gentle heart. Such hearts survive trouble best when they are understood, not judged." Lydia hesitated, glancing toward the hearth. "There's something else. A man came to see me this afternoon, Mr. Rudd's brother. He asked questions about that night, about Daniel. He frightened me." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, he came here as well. I fear he's not content with the truth as it stands. Guilt and vengeance often wear the same expression." Lydia clasped her hands. "Do you think he means harm?" "No," Miss Marple said after a pause. "But I think he may stir old ghosts, best left buried." Her words proved prophetic. Late that night, when the village had gone still, A light was seen flickering near the pond, the faint, wavering glow of a lantern moving along the bank. Tom Bridger, the gardener's son, glimpsed it from the churchyard and told his father, who in turn fetched Inspector Craddock. When they arrived, they found Thomas Rudd kneeling in the mud where his brother had fallen, lantern beside him, hands blackened with earth. In the water's edge lay a small tin box, rusted, but intact, half buried under silt and reeds. Inside were several documents, letters, receipts, and a folded sheet of thick paper bearing Owen Rudd's handwriting. The contents were unmistakable proof of the blackmail. Yes, but also something else. Among the papers was a note addressed, in Rudd's own precise script, "To my brother, should anything befall me." It outlined his extortions, his reasoning, even his contempt for the people he had manipulated. But the last line was different, a jagged scrawl rather than tidy ink. "If I die, it will not be by another's hand but by my own undoing. Tell no one I was weak." The discovery silenced even Thomas. He stood in the torchlight, the note trembling in his hand, and for a long moment his jaw worked as if he might speak, but no words came. Craddock watched him with cautious pity. Miss Marple, who had arrived quietly at the inspector's request, looked on without satisfaction. "You see, Mr. Rudd," she said softly, "truth is rarely kind, but it is always complete. Your brother's death was not murder, only consequence. He sowed the seeds himself, and no one, not even you, can change the harvest now." Thomas closed the box and handed it to Craddock. "Then let it end here," he said finally, his voice hollow. "He was my brother. Whatever he was to others, he was that to me." When dawn came again to Cather's Hollow, the mist lifted for the last time over the pond. The church bell rang its morning call, slow, clear, untroubled. Life resumed, as it always must. Lydia Harrow and her son left the village quietly a week later, bound for the coast, where the sea's endless hush might heal what the hollow could not. Miss Marple, sitting in her garden among her roses, reflected that there was never such a thing as a clean ending, only the settling of dust. People called it closure, but she knew better. What remained was quieter than forgiveness and deeper than guilt. It was understanding the one mercy time always allowed. She poured herself another cup of tea, watching the golden steam curl upward like prayer smoke, and murmured to herself, "We all drown a little in silence, now and then. Some simply forget to surface." Then, with a sigh both weary and content, she reached for her knitting once more, while the village of Cather's Hollow, chastened but unbroken, drifted back into peace.